Good morning, good evening, or good night, whichever one it is for you, whichever one it is. I am very glad you're here to join me for this week's video, which is going to be a very seasonally appropriate list of books, if I may say so myself, because I decided to compile a list of books that are perfect for like the wintry months, the gloomy months, early winter, even maybe late winter, but I think I'm planning to make a different video specifically about Christmassy books, but I think there's kind of a different kind of category, which is just wintry, frosty, magical books, which are exactly what I want to talk about today. So without further ado, let's get right in by talking about the first book on this list, which I want to make The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov, because that is one of the best Russian classics I have ever read. I think it is such a great book and it is so very entertaining and in my opinion perfect for the wintry months. It is not one of those books that have to be read exclusively in the winter because there's not like a lot of snow or I don't know, frosty atmosphere, but I just think something about that book screams winter to me, like early winter, almost that gloomy season, but also kind of New Year's. But I mean, you're gonna have to decide that for yourself. But The Master and Margarita takes place in 1930s of Russia, or some of it takes place in 1930s Russia, which was a very tumultuous time. And Mikhail Bulgakov basically writes a story about the devil visiting Russia in the 1930s, which is so highly satirical, but also very, very symbolical, because it is basically just a very intelligent and witty and entertaining way of critiquing society and politics at the time. And Mikhail Bulgakov really infused so much real life actual criticism into this story without making it feel overly critical, because this entire story is just, it's a fever dream, honestly, because there's the devil visiting Russia, of course, but there's also like talking cats, there's witches, there's all of these supernatural things. And there's also another kind of timeline this book takes place in, because there is this character called the Master who is writing a novel. And every once in a while, a chapter will just be an excerpt from that novel that character is writing. So we are basically reading two different stories. And the novel that the Master is writing is taking place in biblical times, and it's focused on the story of Pontius Pilate and the trial of Jesus, which would eventually lead to Jesus' execution. And those two are kind of almost intertwined in a way, and they do play off each other a lot, and there is so much symbolism connecting those two stories, and it is so highly intentional. And it is one of those books where you're just gonna have the best time. In my opinion, it is a page turner because it's just, you never know what to expect next. And Mikhail Bulgakov is an incredible writer, in my opinion. He writes such fascinating characters and obviously just the most insane storyline you will probably ever read, but he makes it so, I don't know, relatable, entertaining. It's the perfect mixture of serious themes, but very, very funnily depicted. There is such an abundance here in this book, and I believe you would love it, which is why it's on this list, so maybe do check that one out. I highly recommend it. Next, we have The Birds by Terje Vesaas, who's a Norwegian author, and The Birds is one of my favorite books of all time. It basically tells the story of Mattis and Hege, who are siblings. They are adults. They live in a really tiny town in Norway, and for most of the book, it is really snowy. It is so perfect for the winter. It is a book that I think, well, you can read it anytime, just like any other book. No one forces you to read it in the season it's set in, but it is especially great in the winter because the atmosphere is just so perfect. The whole point of the story is Mattis has an intellectual disability, and Hege is kind of the one taking care of him. They are living together in a very small little cottage near a lake in a Norwegian town. And we are basically in Mattis's perspective as he is struggling to interact with the people around him and finding work. It's just, there's a lot of difficulty regarding interpersonal relationships that Mattis faces in this book. But at its core, and this is why I love the book so much, it's where I think it shines the most, is just how precious this character is, how much you start to love him, and just how unique his perspective on the world is. Because he is so in love with nature, and he has such a deep connection to nature and to animals. There's this whole thing about birds that keep visiting their cottage and their migration patterns, and how he starts to really identify with those birds and how much they start to mean to him. The perspective this man has on life is, in my opinion, so much more advanced. In my opinion, the only true perspective to have on life. His values and the way he sees things are so much more just what I consider to be in tune with how you should view the world. It is incredibly heartbreaking. It is such a heartbreaking book. But it is also kind of beautiful. And it's one of those stories that remind you of what the true value in life is and where the true focus of life should be. I felt every single emotion that I am capable of feeling reading that book. And it is one of those reading experiences that will just always stick with me. And one of those books I will always reread, which I think goes to show something, because not just any book is a book that you want to reread, but this is definitely one of those. And so I can highly and in very good conscience recommend that one. And I have talked about it before because I think it's just so underrated. But maybe if you haven't picked it up yet, do that, because I don't think you would regret it. And that being said, I actually do also want to talk about The Ice Palace, also by Tarje Vesos, which is the other book I've read by him. At first, The Ice Palace only follows one young girl who goes to school and lives in a very small Norwegian town where there's a waterfall right next to the town, basically. And the whole thing about that waterfall is it freezes completely every single year and creates this ice palace kind of structure. And then we start getting introduced to another young girl who has just moved to the town, and these two girls become friends, like very fast friends. But then one day, one of the girls goes missing. And presumably, this ice palace structure has something to do with it. The entire rest of the book is basically just an analogy of grief, and it is depicted so beautifully. The way this ice palace is created is probably honestly the best part of this story, though, because the grief is incredibly portrayed, like in an incredible way. But the way this ice palace is described is on a level I've never seen. Like, it is one of the best descriptions of an object I have ever seen. I highly recommend it. It is perfect for this season. Also, of course, very, very sad, but just in a very magical way almost. And in a way that I think only Tarje Vesos is capable of writing. His stories seem to have this very magical, serious, but beautiful quality to them that is very difficult to describe. But yeah, I also highly recommend you check out The Ice Palace by Tarje Vesos. Another book that I think is just perfect for this season is Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga Tokarczuk. Of course, I had to mention that book. It's one of my new absolute favorite books ever. It is about this woman who lives in a very secluded area of this very small town in the Polish mountains. And by secluded area, I mean it's literally a plateau of like 8 houses where only 3 of the houses are permanently occupied. And her main character is kind of the caretaker of all of the houses that are not occupied during the winter, but she does have 2 neighbors who also live on that plateau permanently. But one day, one of those neighbors turns up dead. That is not the only death that is gonna occur in that area, and things are gonna start to become very suspicious. There are possibly animals involved. This book is such a great book just because the description, for one, the atmosphere, just how wintry and frosty and secluded it is. But the main character, this is an incredible character study just of this woman, because she is so eccentric. She's obsessed with astrology, and she is constantly telling you about all of these astrological phenomenons she's learning about. She's also just incredibly passionate about animal rights, which I loved reading about. In general, I just found her so quirky and relatable and lovable, which I don't know what that says about me, but she's one of my favorite main characters ever, honestly. I think she's so, I don't know, edgy, but in such a cool way. I just loved reading about her and following her and seeing where her story was going to take her. Where this story goes is so incredibly interesting. And I loved every page. I think it is perfect for this season. There is so much societal critique here, specifically about animal rights, how horrible people are to animals, to nature, and also kind of to other people, honestly. It's incredible. It's an incredible feat of storytelling, and I highly recommend you check out Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead. Deep winter in the Polish mountains in a secluded cabin where all of these mysterious deaths start to occur. Doesn't that just sound perfect? I certainly think so. Then I also really want to talk about The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, which is the story of Hans Christoph, who at the beginning of the story goes to visit his cousin at a health resort in the Swiss mountains. He's only supposed to stay there for 2 weeks because he's just visiting his cousin who is there to recover from tuberculosis. Well, this 2-week stay ends up being a 7-year stay. He stays there for 7 years. And the story is just about his stay at that resort. Also, so many of the people that are there. It is a very character-driven kind of story where you really start to get to know every one of these characters in depth. And it is such a fascinating thing because this health resort is completely isolated from absolutely every kind of society outside of this small little place in the Swiss mountains, which consists only of sick people and nurses and doctors. Which is such an interesting little microcosm of people. And the way that influences the psychology of the people that are there and how this very unique kind of society is created there. The way they talk, the way they behave, the way words mean certain things that they don't usually do in outside life. Thomas Mann just kind of takes this health resort and almost makes it this sample size of examining society and how society works and how the human psychology works under these extreme circumstances. They have all of these philosophical discussions. It's so interesting because this is a group of people who are so vastly different. They come from all over the world. They have all kinds of different social and educational backgrounds, which leads to some of the most interesting discussions. It is, however, very slow moving though. So it's one of those books where you kind of have to know your reading taste to know if you're gonna like it. But if you like books about just very in-depth character studies, also so much philosophy, specifically the aspect that I found the most interesting is just how time is explored in this book, because time very much moves differently in this health resort because of this unique structure of life where every single day is completely structured exactly the same, which means every single day feels so slow while you're in it, but looking back, it all bleeds together. So it's at once this thing of time moving so slowly, but also feeling like it's rushing past you. And that is described so beautifully and just depicted so profoundly that I've never stopped thinking about it. And I think that is an aspect that is so unique to this book specifically. It is honestly the reason I love this book so much and why I think it is so worth reading. That is The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. And then I also really, really want to recommend to you The Impusium by Olga Tokarczuk, which is often described as being the Magic Mountain-esque, which I do agree with in the sense that it is also based on this premise of our main character, Voynich, I believe you call him. I'm not sure how to pronounce that name, but he goes to a health resort in the mountains, a very isolated little tiny town with a health resort for tuberculosis patients. He wants to go there because he's sick and he wants to recover from his illness, but the health resort is full, so he stays at this guest house near the health resort. And another thing that's kind of similar to the Magic Mountain is we are predominantly focused on this group of guests in the guest house that Voynich is staying at. And all of these guests, every single night, they take this hallucinogenic potion almost, and they start to have these really philosophical discussions. It is quite interesting because they all also come from very varying backgrounds and have very differing opinions, so that makes for a lot of interesting discussions. But I think that's kind of where the similarities end, because although, yes, those focuses are very much similar to the Magic Mountain and the setting in general kind of is as well, I think this is executed in a very different way. There is this whole focus in the Impusium on, for one, just this murder mystery that occurs because for years and years, people have just randomly ended up dead in this town. But it's much wider ranging than that as well, because there's so much discussion of misogyny, of prejudice, of oppression, generational trauma also, because we also follow Voynich's, well, his psychological situation is kind of unique because he's been through a lot of stuff and he's still dealing with the aftermath of that. And Voynich himself, his identity, the person he ends up being, you really get to know him so deeply. And he is such a unique and fascinating character. I think it's so just profound and so beautifully done. Also, another strong point is just the writing itself, because first of all, it describes the nature and the atmosphere surrounding this guest house and this town so beautifully. It also just goes so in depth into its character studies and philosophy, but it's at the same time just so witty and humorous. Olga Tokarczuk has a very unique kind of humor, and in my opinion, it is better than The Magic Mountain. I highly recommend you check out The Impusium. It is my favorite by Olga Tokarczuk for a reason. Next up, I would really like to talk about Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, which is another one that to me is very wintry because it kind of feels, well, I don't know. It's just because of how it feels, but also maybe because I read it in winter. But in my opinion, it is great for the wintry months. It is about Pip, who is an orphan in typical Charles Dickens fashion, and he is being raised by his older sister, much older sister, and her husband. His sister is very cruel to him. She's just not a good person. So Pip is kind of all alone. He is impoverished. He's just very much a victim of his circumstances. Until one day he comes into the expectations of an inheritance, of becoming very wealthy. It is basically about him developing, going from this very poor orphaned boy into a young man who thinks he's about to be extremely wealthy. It is very realistic in that sense. It's very well done, and Pip is such an interesting character to follow. There's also this other character, which is a woman, a very wealthy woman who lives in the town where Pip grows up in. She is famous for just basically being stuck in time, because she is stuck at the point in time where she was left at the altar. And she has developed kind of a vendetta against the male species because of it. And she has this very young relative, this young, beautiful woman, or, well, she's kind of still a girl at the point we're following her, and kind of trains her to be her vessel to take revenge upon the male species. They become involved with Pip, and just things ensue. And in my opinion, it's one of Charles Dickens's best stories, just because it's well written. It is a longer book, but it's beautifully paced. It's always engaging and interesting, and there is so much mystery to it. There's so much intrigue, but it's also just this really in-depth character studies of these very unique and fascinating people. And I just think it's perfect. I love that book, and I think it is very great for winter. So maybe check out Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Next up, I really want to talk about Little Women by Louisa May Alcott, which is the story of four sisters, the Marsh sisters, who are growing up in the 19th century in America, in a small town in Massachusetts, I believe. And although at its core, it's just this really wholesome story about coming of age, being taught all of these life lessons by their mother, who is an incredible mother in my opinion. She's so great, and she really just wants the absolute best for her daughters. They are all, as I said, very different, and they have very different expectations of life and personalities and interests, but it's so interesting to follow their family dynamic and just how their relationships evolve over time. Also the friendships they have outside of each other, outside of their family. But there's also a lot of seriousness in the book, because their father is not present for most of the story because he is off at war. A very wholesome and feel-good kind of book, but realistically so. The first chapter starts out at Christmas, so perfect for this time of the year, although it takes place over a lot of years and so a lot of different seasons, but I think it is great for this time of the year. So maybe check out Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. And while Little Women doesn't exclusively take place and therefore doesn't exclusively need to be read in the winter, one that I think does is Snow Country by Yasunari Kawabata, which is a book about this man. I believe he's a ballet critic, and he goes to visit this small hot spring town in Japan, which is one of the snowiest places on earth. And it is we're in the deep winter as this book is set. And he goes there basically for a holiday to relax. He is married, but there he meets this geisha who he develops a very interesting relationship with. And there is also another young woman who he's also very interested in. It is so beautifully written, beautifully described, but Yasunari Kawabata has this way of writing these beautiful stories in such a restrained way. He basically uses as little words as he possibly can to get across what he's saying, but somehow he still manages to be so poetical and especially very symbolical. There's so much symbolism here. It's one of those books where you kind of want to dissect every single sentence. And it is one of those books that I think, although it's very short, you should take your time reading it and really reading it in depth, because there's just so much to be appreciated here. For one, the atmosphere, just the descriptions of winter, and just also colors. Colors play a huge part here. And the colors that Yasunari Kawabata describes at the certain times, and just the pictures that he comes up with and that he puts inside of your head as you're reading, it is something that only he can really do the way this is done in this book. It's one of those books with a really harsh atmosphere, just about these really disillusioning topics, but set in this magical place, which is such an interesting juxtaposition. And it's also about these really disillusioning human relationships. It's not a feel-good story, but it's a very philosophical, symbolical, and just wintry book, a very wintry book. And it is very unique. And I highly recommend you read it, which is why it's on this list. Another one that I think is just a quintessential wintry read is The Call of the Wild by Jack London, which is about this domesticated dog, this pet, who gets kidnapped and put into this operation of people just who kidnap dogs to make them into sled dogs, and that is what happens to him. And this dog is kind of anthropomorphized because he does seem very human, and obviously we are inside of his head, which in itself is a very interesting way of telling a story. But it's about him coming from this very comfortable, domesticized life inside of this family where he's just loved and just has a very nice and relaxed time, to going to being a working dog in one of the most extreme circumstances you can put an animal into. And how at first he really struggles with it, but how then his instincts, his primitive instincts kind of take over. And it is so interesting to follow. I really loved reading it. And I loved what it had to say about animal instincts. And just obviously there's so much snow and winter. It's also a very harsh read. It's very cruel at times. Specifically, the people are just so cruel, and just the circumstances of these dogs' life kind of cause them to also be very cruel to each other, and just these very wolf-like pack structures. Oh no, let's ignore that. Yeah, it's okay, I forgive you. That was not on purpose, right? Yeah, it was not. Where was I? Yeah, how the pack structures of wolves then kind of start to be translated and actually start to occur in these packs of dogs. I wouldn't call it a feel-good book, but I found it very interesting, and obviously it is very unique. And yeah, it's also very well written. So that is The Call of the Wild by Jack London. I also want to recommend to you Wildfang, also by Jack London, which I think is kind of should be read as a companion piece to The Call of the Wild, because I think they work the best if you read them back to back. No matter which one you read first, that isn't the point. The point is read them back to back, because The Call of the Wild is about a domesticated dog becoming wild again. But Wildfang is about a wolf becoming domesticated almost. So it's kind of the antithesis to The Call of the Wild. And it is also just, it is fascinating. I don't really know which, I think I prefer The Call of the Wild, but I think Wildfang is just as interesting, just as unique, just as well written. Obviously, it's by the same author. But yeah, I just think they complement each other so well. So I did also want to recommend that to you very quickly. An author that I think needs to be on any wintry list is Halldór Laxness, of whom I really want to recommend to you Fish Can Sing, which is my personal favorite by him. It's about Alfgrimur, or however you actually pronounce that name in Icelandic. He grows up with his adoptive grandparents in a very small Icelandic town, a fisher town, I'm pretty sure, in the 20th century. And it is just about his coming of age in this town, the very interesting dynamic in that town he lives in, and also just the very unique and fascinating people that he encounters there. And it's about how he develops this love for this one singer, this one Icelandic singer who's very famous at the time, and how he kind of starts to struggle with the fact that his whole dream in life is just to be a fisher and have a very simple life, but that he's constantly being told by other people that that is too small of a dream, that that cannot be all he wants from life. And so it ends up being this really interesting exploration of the true values in life, because he's so content with where he's at, but he kind of begins to struggle with that, as I said, because of just the expectations of society. He has such a deep connection to nature and to this place he lives in, and it is such a unique climate, this really tiny little Icelandic town. Halldór Laxness writes people in such a unique way. And it is so interesting, the dynamics that are formed there and just how unique every single one of these characters is. And it is a very short book, but every single one of these people feels so alive and you feel like you kind of know them at the end. And specifically, the main character is just one of the most pleasant people I have ever read about. And it is one of my favorite books for a reason. It made Halldór Laxness my favorite author. I highly recommend you read it because it's just afterwards you just kind of feel like you've just been reminded of what life should really be about and what's really important. I don't know, I appreciate it for that so much, and I think you might too. And with that, I am gonna love you and leave you because those were all of my wintry book recommendations. Again, I'm thinking of doing a part 2 with Christmas books because Christmas books are an entirely different genre in my opinion, and I have so many of those to talk about as well. So maybe I will do that. But yeah, for now, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you maybe found some new recommendations, or if you've read any of these books, let me know. I'd be very curious to hear all of your opinions. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you being here. I hope you're having a nice day. If you are not having a nice day, that is fine too. I'm thinking about you either way. And I'm already looking forward to seeing you again next week. And Blue is as well. Blue is kind of the chaos bunch in this video, huh? You just want all the attention. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for being here, listening to me talk about books. And yeah, we're gonna see you again very soon. Until then, bye-bye. Say bye-bye. Oh, okay. Bye.